I lived in that house for more than 30 years. One day I realized I was no longer being asked for my opinion on my own life. Some wounds do not come from strangers. They come slowly, from the people we once trusted as family. If it were you, what would you do when everything around you still seems calm, but inside, you begin to feel yourself slowly disappearing? I did not react right away. I chose silence and observation, and what happened afterwards made me understand that the truth always finds its own way into the light. If you are in a relationship where your voice keeps growing quieter, perhaps this story is meant for you. My name is Helen Moore. I am 62 years old. I live in a large house in Redwood Hills, a quiet suburban neighborhood where mornings usually begin with birdsong and afternoons end with sunlight slanting through the maple trees in the front yard. I have lived in this house for more than 30 years. Nearly my entire marriage to David is tied to it. When we moved here, I was young, hopeful, and convinced that as long as two people tried hard enough, everything would work out. Time passed faster than I ever expected. 30 years of marriage went by in what felt like a blink, leaving behind many habits, much silence, and very few things still spoken out loud. From the outside, my life looks complete. David is a capable worker. We have never lacked anything. I do not worry about money or significant household matters. I have time to tend the garden, read, cook, and keep everything in order as I am used to. People often say I am lucky. Perhaps they are not wrong. I have never considered myself an unhappy person, but some things do not exist on the surface. They lie much deeper, in places people rarely speak about, even to themselves. I grew accustomed to giving way, giving up words, giving up decisions. I even gave up my own thoughts to keep peace in the house. At first it was voluntary. Then it became a habit, and eventually I could no longer clearly tell the difference between yielding and staying silent because no one was listening anymore. I am not angry with David. At least I do not let anger stay long in my heart. In life, everything has its own order. Those who do wrong will, sooner or later, have to face the truth. No one needs to push. No one needs to force it. The truth always has its own way of appearing. I believe this not because someone taught me, but because I have lived long enough to see it happen again and again. When the mind is calm, one can remain steady. When the mind is unsettled, every decision becomes prone to error. That is why whenever I sense something unclear at home, I usually choose to pause. I do not rush to ask questions. I do not rush to react. I observe. I listen. To others, that may seem like weakness. To me, it is a way of protecting myself. I do not need to win against anyone. I only need not to lose the sense of calm that took me half a lifetime to learn how to preserve. And until that point, I still believed that as long as I lived gently enough and remained clear-minded sufficient, everything would eventually sort itself out. I began to notice minimal changes, so small that if one did not live in this house every day, they might go completely unnoticed. Meals were often already prepared. In the past, I liked to cook with my own hands, even simple dishes. Cooking made me feel that I still had a presence in this house. But gradually, David told me I should rest more. He said I no longer needed to worry about such small tasks. At first, I felt relieved. Then I grew accustomed to it, and by the time I realized it, no one was asking me what I wanted to eat anymore. The gatherings David referred to as work also changed. Before, I would occasionally go with him, not to discuss business, to greet people, sit quietly, listen, and then leave. But recently, I was no longer invited. David said those meetings lasted too long and were not suitable for my health. I nodded and said no more. I thought he was being considerate. Laura, David's sister, began to appear more often. She came to the house under the pretense of helping, organizing paperwork, discussing some financial matters. Laura always spoke quickly, efficiently, and decisively. I listened, but rarely joined the conversation. Whenever I was about to ask something, David would usually answer for me. I told myself that they had worked together for years and that I did not need to interfere. There were moments when I felt my memory slowing down slightly. I forgot where I had placed my keys. I had to pause for a few seconds to remember what I had just intended to do. My body felt more tired than before. In the afternoons, I often sat still for long periods, looking out at the garden without thinking clearly. I did not panic. At my age, such changes were not entirely unusual. I had never thought of doubting my own family. I believe that in a family, as long as trust remains, there is still room for repair. I reminded myself not to jump to conclusions when my mind was not yet calm. Each time I felt something unclear, I chose to pause, not to react, not to ask hasty questions. I believed that when I was calm enough, what needed to be seen would reveal itself. At that time, I did not name those signs. I only thought that perhaps I was moving a little more slowly in a life that had long been running to someone else's rhythm. Maria Alvarez came to my house in early spring that year. David said that Laura knew someone at a labor placement agency and thought I needed extra help around the house. I did not object. I had grown used to others making such decisions on my behalf. Maria was quiet, very quiet. Her English was only sufficient to answer simple questions. Most of the time she nodded, smiled, or spoke a few brief words. She worked carefully and slowly, almost without making any sound. There were moments when I was in the house and forgot her presence altogether, until everything had been arranged more neatly than before. She was not curious. She did not ask about personal matters. She did not insert herself into my family's conversations. I thought that life had taught her how to carry herself that way. I did not ask much about Maria's past. I believe that everyone has things that do not need to be spoken aloud to have value. I treated Maria the way I treated anyone who entered my home. I greeted her every morning. I said thank you when she finished her work. If I needed to ask for something, I spoke slowly, clearly, and patiently, not because I believed I was doing anything noble, but because I thought that a person, regardless of position, deserves to be regarded as a person. There were afternoons when I brewed tea and sat by the window while Maria quietly mopped the floor nearby. I said nothing. Neither did she. Yet in those moments of silence, I felt a strange sense of calm, not because we were close, but because neither of us needed to present anything to the other. I did not know that those small, steady gestures were forming an invisible thread. I did not realize that simple, unshowy respect can sometimes be the very thing that makes someone pause and look at you a little longer. At the time, Maria was simply a quiet housekeeper in a home already accustomed to silence. I never imagined that this very silence would later become the starting point of something entirely different. That evening began like many others. David and Laura left the house after a light meal. They said there was an urgent meeting they needed to attend. I did not ask further. I was used to seeing them to the door, standing still as I watched the car disappear around the curve in front of the house. The house grew quiet very quickly. Not the kind of quiet that feels comforting, but the familiar silence of an ample space left with only one person inside. I went into the kitchen, intending to make a pot of hot tea. In the refrigerator, there was a pot of soup carefully covered. I remembered seeing it earlier that afternoon, but I did not think much of it. Maria appeared at the kitchen doorway. She was holding a cleaning cloth. As usual, I turned toward her and smiled, about to tell her that she could leave early, but Maria did not move. She stood there for a moment, her eyes shifting toward the window, as if to make sure we were alone. Then she spoke, in English, clearly, calmly. "Please do not eat the soup in the refrigerator tonight." I stood still, not out of fear, but because I needed a few seconds to understand what I had just heard. That voice was not the one I had heard for months. I did not scream. I did not step back. I set the teapot down on the counter, aware that my breathing had quickened slightly. I remained silent. I slowed my breathing, the way I always did when something unexpected occurred. I noticed fear beginning to surface, very lightly, very quickly, but it had not yet spread. I did not push it away. I observed it. Maria looked at me without pressing, without offering further explanation. She stood there, waiting for my response. Her calmness kept me from drawing hasty conclusions. I knew that if I reacted immediately, things could easily slip out of control. "Why?" I asked, my voice low and measured. Maria did not answer right away. She took a quiet breath, like someone who had weighed her words carefully before speaking. I understood that what I was about to hear might not be pleasant, but I also understood something else. When a crisis arrives, the first thing is not to run, but to stop long enough to avoid losing one's direction. And that evening, I chose to stop. Maria pulled out a chair and sat across from me. She sat very straight, her hands resting neatly on her lap, like someone accustomed to maintaining composure in difficult conversations. I realized that from that moment on, Maria was no longer the silent housekeeper I saw every day, but I did not rush to assign her a new role. I listened. She said that she had been hired through an intermediary agency. According to the arrangement, her job was to stay in the house, observe me, and report what I did each day. She had been instructed to pretend not to understand English so that no one in the household would be cautious around her. Maria explained this in an even tone, without justification, without apology, as if she were merely recounting a sequence of events. I felt my throat go dry, not from anger, but from a strange sense of emptiness. I had believed that silence was safe. It turned out that silence, too, could be monitored. Maria continued. She spoke about the conversations she had overheard, about plans discussed when everyone believed she could not understand. The ultimate goal, as far as she knew, was to have me regarded as no longer mentally capable of making decisions about my own life. Once that happened, everything related to the assets would be transferred into someone else's hands. I did not cry. I did not smile. I sat there, feeling each word fall, like cold drops seeping slowly into a surface that had long been dry. I thought of the small changes I had once dismissed, the pre-prepared meals. The decisions were made without my input. Everything suddenly rearranged itself into a different order. For a moment, I wondered whether I should be angry, whether I should confront them, make a scene, let the hurt find a loud release. But immediately after, another question appeared, more evident than the first. If this was the burden they were already carrying, did I need to become someone who added another burden for myself? I looked at Maria and asked her why she was telling me this. She was silent for a moment, then said she did not want to continue doing something she knew was wrong. I did not ask further. I understood that everyone has a boundary. When that boundary is crossed, one is forced to stop. I told Maria that I had no intention of retaliating against anyone. I did not want to turn myself into someone else to respond to what was happening. What I needed now was not to hurt them, but to protect the truth before it was completely distorted. Maria nodded. She said that if I allowed it, she would help me preserve what needed preserving. I did not answer immediately. I needed more time to listen to myself, but deep inside I already knew one thing. Once the truth has appeared, turning away from it is the most dangerous choice of all, and I no longer wanted to turn away. Maria did not speak immediately after I had been silent for quite a long time. She waited. That waiting made me feel that I was not being forced to decide anything while my mind was still unsettled. When I nodded to signal that I was ready to hear more, she finally spoke. She told me that before taking this job, she had assisted a group that specialized in gathering information in civil disputes. Not official investigations, just quiet work, recording things others failed to notice. In one such case, she witnessed an older woman being entirely controlled by her own son. The woman was not beaten. She was not threatened. She was stripped, little by little, of her right to decide, until no one asked what she thought anymore. That story stayed with Maria for a long time. "I didn't think I would encounter something like that again," she said, her voice lowering, "until I came here." I did not ask for more details. I understood that some memories do not need to be excavated to prove anything. They linger because they have not yet been placed where they belong. We did not discuss confrontation. We did not talk about questioning David or Laura. I told Maria that I did not want to turn everything into something loud and dramatic. She nodded, as if that was something she had already considered. We agreed not to act impulsively, not to create any sudden changes in our daily routines. Everything would continue as before. I would keep eating, resting, and living according to my familiar rhythm. Maria would continue her work as usual, quiet and steady. The only difference was that we began to observe more closely, to record small details, to listen to conversations that seemed incidental, without adding anything, without interpreting, simply keeping what actually occurred. There were nights when I lay awake for a long time. I considered stopping about whether everything might feel lighter if I did not know. The truth, when faced directly, does not always bring relief. Sometimes it only gives pain a more precise shape. But then I realized that avoidance does not make things dissolve on their own. What is hidden can only grow in the dark. If I turned away, I would not be preserving peace. I would only be postponing a larger collision. So I chose to stay with the truth, even without knowing where it would lead me. Not because I had become stronger, but because I understood that courage is sometimes nothing more than not running away, even when one's steps are slow and very quiet. Dr. Thomas Reed arrived at the house in the early afternoon. The sun was gentle that day, and the air in the garden was so still that I could clearly hear dry leaves brushing against one another as the wind passed through. I was already seated in the living room, my hands resting on my knees, my back straight against the chair. I did not try to appear tired, nor did I try to appear more alert than usual. I was simply in my own state. David opened the door. Laura stood beside him, her expression serious, as if attending an important meeting. Dr. Reed shook my hand, smiling politely, his eyes observing quickly but carefully. I recognized that look. Not curiosity, but the gaze of someone who already carried a template in his mind. We sat down. I agreed to answer his questions. I did not refuse, nor did I object. When the doctor asked, I responded slowly, not because I did not understand, but because I paused briefly before each answer. I noticed that when I spoke slowly, the people around me became more impatient than I did. The doctor asked about my daily routine, about what I did during the day. I described them without adding or subtracting anything. At times, he turned to David to confirm. David answered for me, as if it were natural. I let it be. I did not interrupt. I took note. At one point, the doctor said he had been informed that I was often forgetful, often confused about simple matters. I looked at him, then at David. I did not argue. I said that sometimes I forgot, but I still remembered how long I had lived in this house, how I had cared for the garden, and every dish David had liked for many years. The doctor wrote things down. I did not know what he was recording, but I noticed that some questions were asked as if the answers were already predetermined. Questions are not meant to understand, but to confirm an assumption. In that moment, I wondered whether I was doing the right thing. I asked whether sitting there, remaining silent as everything unfolded, meant I was pushing my family toward a point of no return. A very real fear crept in, not fear of what might happen to me, but fear of losing what I had once called family. I felt my heart grow heavy. I could have stood up. I could have said everything. I could have ended the meeting immediately. But then I realized that if I did so at that moment, I would not be protecting the truth. I would only be releasing emotion, so I chose to remain seated. I decided to stay honest with reality, even when that reality was uncomfortable. I answered the remaining questions, still slowly, still clearly. I did not try to prove that I was mentally sharp, nor did I pretend to be weaker than I was. I allowed everything to reveal itself through the way others spoke for me, decided for me. At the end of the session, Dr. Reed said he needed more time to assess the situation. His tone was no longer as specific as it had been at the beginning. I heard that and understood that minor contradictions had begun to surface, not because I pointed them out, but because they collided with one another on their own. After the doctor left, I remained alone in the living room for a few more minutes. I felt tired but not panicked. I knew that from this moment on, nothing would return to the way it was. But I also knew that I had not betrayed myself that afternoon. And for me, that was enough to move forward. Everything unfolded more quietly than I had imagined. There was no shouting, no chaotic scenes like those people often describe. Just another morning, when legal representatives stepped into the house where I had lived for more than half my life, with calm demeanor and clear questions. Maria stood beside me. She did not speak much. She handed me documents that had already been prepared. Records, preserved conversations, no commentary attached, no additional explanations. The truth was placed precisely where it belonged, neither higher nor lower. David and Laura initially reacted with shock, then denial, then silence. I remained seated, listening to what was being said, as if I were hearing a story that did not entirely belong to me. Some details I had anticipated, others still weighed on me, even though I had prepared myself. I did not feel happy, nor did I think the satisfaction people often expect when the truth is revealed. Instead, I felt tired, a deep kind of exhaustion, not in the body, but from having traveled a long distance in silence to reach that moment. When the initial procedures were completed, I was asked to remain alone in the living room. That room had once been where I welcomed guests, where I waited for David each evening, where I believed everything in my life had settled into place. Now it looked different, even though the furniture was the same. Perhaps because I was seeing it through different eyes, I felt light, not light from shedding a burden, but light like the air after fog lifts on a cloudy morning. Not sudden, not brilliant, just no longer blurred. I saw things more clearly, including the things that hurt. For a brief moment, I wondered whether I should feel guilty, whether the truth being spoken had caused someone too much pain. But then I understood that the truth does not cause harm. It only ends a concealment that has gone on for too long. I did not need to stand up to prove anything. I did not need to say that I had been right. Everything had rearranged itself according to its own order. And in the remaining quiet after that morning, I felt clearly for the first time that I was standing on solid ground, no longer lost in a thick fog. I sat there for a long time, not thinking much, just breathing, and allowing the truth at last to remain exactly where it belonged. The legal outcomes that followed were not entirely unexpected, yet they were far from light. Everything was handled according to procedure, step by step, through documents, meetings, and decisions made by people who did not know me. I attended when required, signed when asked, and listened far more than I spoke. I did not see those outcomes as a victory. I did not feel that I had reclaimed anything. If anything, I had only reclaimed the right to stand in my proper place within my own life story. But the cost of doing so was not small. The house became quieter than ever. No more familiar footsteps, no more conversations, however brief. Evenings felt longer, not because time moved more slowly, but because there was no longer anyone with whom to share those stretches of silence. At times, I found myself sitting by the window for a long while, thinking of nothing in particular, simply sensing the emptiness more clearly now that it was no longer covered. I also felt regret. Not regret for what was lost, but for what might once have been different. I thought about the years I chose silence, not out of fear, but out of the belief that yielding would preserve harmony. I did not blame myself, but I did not deny that there were moments when I had made myself too small. Loss was unavoidable. Not only the loss of a relationship, but the loss of an image of family that I had held onto for many years. When that image collapsed, I had to face a void that no one could immediately fill. Yet through all of this, I understood one thing very clearly. Justice did not come to comfort me, nor did it come to punish anyone in a way that would make me feel satisfied. Justice did only one thing. It rearranged a disrupted order. It returned everyone to the place they had chosen through their own actions. When I looked at everything that way, the pain did not disappear, but it no longer led me astray. I did not need to feel joy to prove that I was right. I only needed to know that from that point on, I was no longer living within a distorted arrangement. And for me, that was enough to keep moving forward, even though the road ahead still held many empty spaces that would take time to fill. After everything, I did not move away. I stayed in the same house but lived differently. I cleared out my belongings. Things no longer needed were given away. Corners once heavy with memory were open to let in light. I learned to live more slowly, not out of fear, but because I no longer needed to follow anyone else's rhythm. I did not become a hero, nor did I want to. I did not tell my story as a triumph. I saw it simply as a stretch of road already traveled, with its slow steps, missteps, and necessary pauses. I understood that if I tried to turn myself into a symbol of strength, I would once again neglect the fragile parts that had helped me recognize what was real. I did not start an organization, nor did I step forward to lead anything. I was not suited for that. I only did tiny things. When someone asked, I listened. When I could help, I helped within my limits. No promises, no advice. Just enough presence so that the other person did not feel alone. Some mornings, I sat in the kitchen, brewed tea, and watched sunlight touch the table's surface. There were no grand plans for the day, no list of tasks to complete to prove anything. I allowed everything to unfold slowly, in a way I had forgotten for many years. I still had moments of sadness. There were nights when the quiet returned, along with questions that no longer had anyone to ask, but I no longer rushed to fill them. I let the sadness remain like a guest passing through, leaving on its own when the time came. I came to understand that letting go is not the same as giving up. Letting go means not holding tightly to what no longer belongs to me. When I let go of the need to win, to be right, to be acknowledged, my mind grew much lighter, not because I was above anyone, but because I was no longer weighing myself down. If I had to condense what I learned into a single thought, it would be this. I did not defeat anyone. I did not let my mind go, and by holding on to that, life, quietly and without spectacle, opened a path wide enough for me to continue forward, slowly but steadily.